In this section, we're going to write out all the JavaScript code required to implement this Node application. Now, remember, if you're here in this course without a background in Node, or maybe you're not interested in JavaScript at all, that's totally fine. You can skip this section and go to the next section where I've put all the code that we're going to write right now up, then you can just copy paste it over very easily. So again, if you don't want to write out a bunch of JavaScript, just continue into the next section. Otherwise, stick around and we'll get started right now. All right, so to get started, I'm going to flip back over to my terminal. You'll notice that I'm again in a workspace directory of sorts, so I'm no longer inside that web directory that we were working in earlier. Inside of here, we're going to make a new project folder, and I'm going to call it, how about just visits, like so, because that's what this application is doing. It's counting some number of visits. I'm then going to change into that directory, and then I'll open up my code editor inside there. Now we're going to create two separate files very similarly to what we did on the last application we worked on. We're going to have a package.json file that's going to record all the dependencies of our application, and then we're going to have an index.js file which will serve as the actual Node server. Let's first make the package.json file. So inside of my root project directory, I'll make a new file called package.json. And then inside of here, we're going to specify some number of dependencies and a scripts section as well. So first we'll do our dependencies. Don't forget that we are going to use double quotes everywhere inside this file. We're going to pull in Express, and I don't really care what version of Express we use, so I'll put an asterisk. And then we're also going to get a second dependency that we did not use previously called Redis. Now, this Redis dependency right here is a JavaScript client library for connecting to a Redis server. So this library right here is how we are going to somehow kind of connect over to our running Redis server and pull information from it and update information inside of it as well. Now for the Redis library, we are going to use a specific version. We're going to get 2.8.0. So that's the two dependencies we're going to need. I'm going to put a comma in, and then we're going to add on a scripts section as well. And very much like we had last time, we'll have a single start script, and anytime we run that, it will actually execute node index.js. All right, so that's it for our package.json file. I'm now going to make a second file that's going to be our index.js file, and that's going to hold all of our actual application code. So I'm going to make a separate file called index.js. And at the top, we're going to require in two separate libraries. We're going to get Express again. And then we're also going to import that Redis library that we just added as a dependency. We'll then make a new instance of an Express application. And at the same time, we're also going to set up a connection to our Redis server. So I'll say const client. So client right here is going to represent our connection over to the Redis server. And we'll say redis.create client, like so. Now we're going to come back and add in a little bit more information to this create client function call right here. We're going to eventually specify the host, or like the URL or the address of the Redis server that we're trying to connect to, and its port as well. But that's going to be a part of a little bit of conversation that we'll have down the road once we start to actually put together the Docker side of this application. After that, we'll add in a route handler for our root route. We'll say anytime that someone comes to the root route of our application, we're going to call this callback function. Now inside of here, we're going to attempt to use this client connection over to the Redis server to get the current number of times that our page has been visited. So to do so, I'll say client.get visits. And then as a second argument, we'll add in a callback that gets called with a possible error object and the number of visits that are stored inside of Redis. And then we'll send a response back to whoever made this original request. We'll just say number of visits is, and then we'll add on through some simple string concatenation visits, like so. After doing so, after sending this response back to the user, we'll make sure that we also update the number of times that this page has been visited. And so to do so, we're going to again reference our client object. I'll say client.set visits is going to be visits plus 1. Now, a little bit of a gotcha here. This visits variable that we get back from Redis is actually going to come back to us as a string rather than the integer that we would really expect it to be. And so just to make sure that we add 1 to an integer and not a string, I'm going to wrap this with a parseInt function call. Then the last thing we need to do is add on a app.listen. We'll again use port 8081. And then once the application successfully starts listening, we'll do a console log that says listening on port 8081. Now, one last very quick thing that we need to do inside of here. You'll notice that we're kind of assuming that the instant our server starts up, we've already got some number of visits stored, or like there's some existing initial value for visits. That's probably not the case. So one thing that we'll do right after we start up our client right here, we'll make sure that we do a client.set visits to 0. So this right here is going to initialize our number of visits to be 0. And then every time that a user comes to our root route, we'll pull that number out and then increment it by 1 and store it back on the Redis side. Okay, so that's it for this file. That's all the application code that we need to write, with the exception of a little bit of networking stuff that we're going to put inside of here to make sure that we connect to our Redis server. So let's take a quick break right here. We'll continue in the next section, and we're going to continue working on our Docker setup.